10 kilometers. That is the distance between where a missile hit the ground in Amman, Jordan, and the five-star hotel where Prince Harry and Meghan Markle had been sleeping just one night before. Not 1 week before, not 1 month before, one night, 15 minutes by car, close enough to hear, close enough to feel, and they were already gone by a margin so slim that the people around them are still processing it. This is the story of a royal visit that nobody expected to become a near miss, a trip built on compassion, on hospital beds and quiet conversations, on a mother from Gaza and a teenager from Syria, and how, less than 24 hours after Harry and Meghan left the city, everything around them exploded. Here is what happened, all of it, from the beginning. To understand the full weight of this story, you need to understand why Harry and Meghan were in Jordan in the first place. Because this was not a casual trip. It was not a holiday. It was not a photo opportunity dressed up as a humanitarian visit. It was something more deliberate than that and more personal. Jordan occupies one of the most difficult positions in the entire Middle East. It shares borders with Israel, Syria, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia. It has absorbed millions of refugees over the past 2 decades, more per capita than almost any other nation on Earth. And it has done all of this while holding itself together politically, economically, and diplomatically under conditions that have fractured other countries in the region entirely. That is not a small thing. That is the result of decades of careful, exhausting, often thankless work by a government and a people who chose stability over chaos when chaos would have been easier. King Abdullah II and Queen Rania have built Jordan's international reputation on exactly that. On moderation, on diplomacy, on a willingness to engage with all sides of a conflict rather than simply choosing one. Queen Rania, in particular, has been a consistent and articulate voice for humanitarian causes across the Arab world. She and Meghan have a shared language, not just literally, but in terms of the kind of soft power advocacy they both believe in, the kind that does not involve armies or sanctions, but hospital visits and public attention and the stubborn insistence that individual human beings matter even when geopolitics suggests otherwise. At the center of that effort, the Human Center, is a hospital. The King Hussein Cancer Centre in Amman, one of the most respected oncology institutions in the Arab world, a place that does not turn away patients because of where they come from, what passport they carry, or which side of a conflict their family happens to live on. It treats people, full stop. That is its only mandate. And in a region where almost every institution has been pulled into the gravitational field of one conflict or another, that mandate is more remarkable than it sounds. Harry and Meghan have a long-standing connection to cancer care causes globally. For Meghan, the intersection of healthcare access and conflict-affected communities is a focus she has returned to repeatedly since stepping back from official royal duties. For Harry, the experience of watching his mother engage with humanitarian causes, and of seeing firsthand during his military service the human cost of regional instability, gives him a frame of reference that goes beyond the ceremonial. When they confirmed the February trip, the core of the itinerary was clear from the start. They were going to the hospital, they were going to sit with patients, they were going to listen. They flew into Amman on February 26th, checked into the St. Regis Hotel, the same property where Prince William and Princess Catherine had stayed during their own visit to Jordan years earlier, unpacked, briefed their team on the patient schedule for the following morning. And then, early the next day, they went to work. The King Hussein Cancer Centre is not built for comfort, it is built for survival. The hallways are clean and efficient, the staff move fast. There is a particular kind of quiet in oncology wards, not peaceful quiet but held breath quiet. The quiet of people concentrating very hard on staying calm, staff who have learned to read a patient's face before they say a word. Families who have learned the rhythms of a place they never wanted to know this well. Harry and Meghan walked in without fanfare, no long ceremony at the entrance, no formal receiving line or waiting dignitaries. They greeted the medical staff, received a brief orientation from the center's director, and began moving through the wards. Their security detail stayed back, unobtrusive. This was not the kind of visit designed to be felt as an event, it was designed to be felt as a presence. What they found inside was extraordinary, not because it was unusual for that hospital, but because the scale of need is almost impossible to absorb from the outside. Patients had come from across the region, from Gaza, from Syria, from Iraq, from Yemen. Many had crossed borders with little more than hope and a referral letter. Some had left entire families behind. Some had been in the hospital for weeks already, alone in a country that was not their own, in a city whose language they did not speak, receiving treatment for diseases that their home countries lacked the equipment to diagnose, let alone address. The cancer these patients were fighting had not appeared because of the conflicts around them, but the conflicts had made everything harder. The late diagnoses, because clinics had been bombed or evacuated. The delayed treatment, because drug supply routes kept closing. The absence of family support, because crossing borders required permissions that did not always come. The illness itself was the enemy. But the war had handed that enemy extra time. Meghan was brought to a family waiting area early in the morning. It was a small room, functional, not comfortable. A few chairs arranged around a low table, the kind of room that exists in every hospital in the world, where families sit when they cannot be in the room with someone they love, where time moves differently, where a clock on the wall feels like a judgment. Sitting in that room was a mother. She had come from Gaza. Her child was receiving treatment for a form of childhood cancer that simply could not be addressed back home, not because the doctors there lacked skill, but because the equipment required to treat it had been destroyed. She had made the journey through active conflict, through military checkpoints, through uncertainty that never fully lifted to get to this room, in this hospital, in this city. And she had been sitting there largely alone for several days. Meghan did not sit across from her. She sat beside her, no interpreter standing over her shoulder, no publicist in the doorway with a prepared statement. She sat down, took the woman's hand, and she stayed, quiet, present, real. The woman, who had barely spoken in days, began to cry. Not the sharp, sudden cry of new shock, the slow, releasing cry of someone who has been holding themselves together for too long, and who has finally, in the presence of another human being who is simply paying full attention, been allowed to stop. People in that room said afterward that it lasted several minutes, that neither of them spoke, that Meghan did not try to fix anything or say the right thing. She just stayed. On another ward, Harry was moving through the oncology unit, pausing at bedsides, speaking with patients through interpreters, asking the kind of careful, specific questions that make clear someone has actually read the briefings before walking in. He was not performing concern, he was expressing it, in the way that only comes from having been in difficult rooms before and knowing that sometimes your job is simply to not look away. He came to the bed of a 16-year-old boy from Syria. The boy was alone. His parents had not been able to travel. He was preparing to begin his first round of chemotherapy the following morning, and he was, by the account of those in the room, visibly frightened. Not the dramatic, expressive fear of someone who has decided to show it, but the still, contained fear of someone trying very hard to hold it together because he does not want to make anyone feel worse. Harry pulled up a chair. He sat down at the level of the bed, not standing above it. He stayed for much longer than his schedule had allocated. He talked about fear, not around it, not through euphemisms, directly through it. He told the boy that being afraid of something genuinely hard did not mean he was weak. Meant he understood what was in front of him. He said that the people who pretend not to be afraid in situations like this are not brave, they are just not paying attention. The boy, who had not made eye contact since Harry entered the room, looked up, and then, slowly, he smiled. It was a small thing. But in a ward full of people fighting for their lives, with everything happening in the world outside those walls, it was the whole point of the visit. Beyond the individual patient moments, Harry and Meghan also sat with senior medical staff, oncologists, administrators, psychologists, who walked them through the institutional challenges facing cancer care in conflict-affected regions. the supply chain disruptions, the difficulty of sourcing chemotherapy drugs when routes through war zones keep closing, the psychological load on medical staff who are not just doctors and nurses, but often the only consistent human presence in a patient's life for weeks at a time. One senior physician at the center, speaking afterward, said that in 20 years of hosting dignitaries and public figures, few had made his staff feel as genuinely understood as Harry and Meghan did that morning. That is not a line crafted for a press release. That is something a tired doctor said after a long shift, because it was true. By mid-afternoon, the visit was winding down. Final conversations, final goodbyes. Meghan was handed a small piece of hand-embroidered cloth made by a patient who had been discharged earlier that week. She held it carefully before folding it and putting it in her bag. Harry paused at the hospital entrance on the way out. He stood in the corridor and looked back toward the wards for almost a full minute before turning toward the car. Nobody recorded what he was thinking, but everyone who was there remembered it. They checked out of the St. Regis that evening, bags loaded, security sweep done, vehicles moving through the streets of Amman toward Queen Aliyah International Airport. The city was calm, the night sky was clear, the streets around the hotel were quiet in the way that Amman is often quiet in the evening, not empty, just settled. There was no visible sign of what was building across the region. No indication in the air, in the news cycle, in the city itself, of what was less than 24 hours away. Harry and Meghan boarded their flight, and Amman, as far as they could see, was at peace. It would not stay that way. Now here is the detail that security analysts and diplomatic sources are quietly discussing, and it is the detail that changes the entire weight of this story. Royal schedules change all the time. One extra meeting gets added, one extended patient visit runs long. One request comes in from a local official, asking for one more engagement before departure. It happens on virtually every international trip. Itineraries are living documents. They shift, they expand, they get extended by hours or by days depending on what is happening on the ground. Had Harry and Meghan's visit been extended by a single day, just one, they would have still been in that hotel when the missile came down. One day. That is the margin. On the night of February 28th, a ballistic missile struck a residential neighborhood in East Amman. The sound was described by witnesses as a single enormous crack. Not like thunder, which rolls and builds and gives you a moment to register what is coming. This was instantaneous, a crack, and then a pressure wave moving outward through the city, rattling windows across a wide radius, waking families who had already gone to bed, sending people to their balconies, and then, when they understood what they had heard, immediately back inside. Emergency services were on the scene within minutes. The area was sealed off. Jordanian authorities confirmed the strike and began the process of assessing damage and casualties. Civil defense teams worked through the early hours of the morning. By dawn, it was clear that this was not an isolated incident. It was part of a wave of retaliatory strikes that had been launched across the region in the hours prior. Iran had responded. The context is important, but it does not require a lengthy lecture. This strike was part of a broader escalation between Iran, the United States, and Israel, a conflict that has simmered for years and in recent weeks had accelerated with unusual speed. Coordinated American and Israeli strikes on Iranian military infrastructure had been carried out in the preceding days. Iran's response came in the form of ballistic missiles aimed at multiple regional targets. Jordan, a country that had not participated in those strikes, a country that had in fact been working quietly through diplomatic channels to de-escalate the situation, found itself in the flight path of one of them. It landed in a residential area. It did not hit a military installation. It did not hit a government building. It hit an apartment neighborhood in a city of ordinary people who had woken up that morning with no expectation that their day would end with emergency services at their door. Jordan's airspace was restricted within the hour. The government issued emergency communications to its citizens. World leaders began releasing statements. The UN Security Council was convened for an emergency session, and the international press, which had spent the previous 2 days covering Harry and Meghan's hospital visit with mild interest, suddenly had a very different story to write about Amman. And when the coordinates of the missile's impact site were mapped against the location of the St. Regis Hotel, where Harry and Meghan had been staying just the night before, the distance came back at approximately 10 kilometers. 10 kilometers. In a city the size of Amman, that is not far. That is a short taxi ride. That is the distance you cover on a morning jog. It is close enough that guests on the upper floors of the St. Regis, had there still been guests there, would almost certainly have heard the strike, would have felt, at minimum, the low vibration of the pressure wave passing through the building, would have known, without waiting for a notification on their phone, that something had gone wrong very close by. Security professionals who work in the field of very important person protection are careful not to over-dramatize proximity incidents. They are trained to assess, not speculate. But several analysts, speaking on background to journalists covering the story, noted that a 10-kilometer radius in an urban environment is what they categorize as a significant proximity event. It is close enough to require an immediate reassessment of any active protection detail in the area. Close enough to trigger emergency protocols. None of those protocols were needed, because Harry and Meghan were already wheels up and heading home. But the margin, the simple, factual margin of less than 24 hours, is the kind of detail that does not leave the people around them quickly. News of the strike reached Harry and Meghan in California. Their team confirmed they had been briefed, that they were in contact with the relevant authorities, and that they were relieved to have departed before the escalation began. It was a measured, appropriate response, the kind carefully calibrated in situations like this to convey awareness without amplifying alarm. But relief in situations like this is rarely uncomplicated, because they had just been in that city. They had just sat with a mother from Gaza in a hospital waiting room. They had just spent time with a 16-year-old Syrian boy who was spending the night before chemotherapy alone in a foreign country. Those people were still in Amman. They were still in that hospital. They were still there when the missile hit. And while the hospital itself was not struck, and the patients and staff were safe, the psychological reality of watching from a distance while a city you have just left becomes a crisis zone is not something that resolves quickly. There is something specific about the experience of being close to danger and then learning about it retrospectively, finding out after you are already home that the place where you were standing 24 hours ago has become breaking news. It is different from experiencing danger in real time, where at least your instincts are engaged and there is something to respond to. The retrospective version produces a quieter, slower kind of unease, a recalibration, a taking stock of timing in a way that does not generate adrenaline but does stay with you. Harry has spoken in the past, in his memoir, in interviews, in conversations with veterans he has met through his Invictus work, about the particular weight of proximity, of being close to something dangerous and emerging intact while others do not, of the way that experience does not simply close off when the immediate threat has passed. That residue stays. It shapes how you think about risk, about timing, about the randomness of where you happen to be on any given day. His military service in Afghanistan gave him an intimate familiarity with that calculation, with how thin the line between safety and danger can be, and how much of where you fall depends on factors entirely outside your control. This moment, in its own quieter way, will have added to that. But step back from the personal dimension for a moment. Step back from the near-miss angle entirely. And look at what this story actually is. Inside the King Hussein Cancer Centre, on the morning of February 27th, there was a woman from Gaza learning that her child was responding to treatment. There was a teenage boy from Syria finding a reason to stop being afraid, at least for a few minutes. There were doctors working, double shifts, nurses carrying emotional loads that would crush most people, volunteers sitting with patients who had no one else to sit with them, and Harry and Meghan were there for that. They walked into that building, they sat in those rooms, they showed up. And then, outside those walls, in the same city, under the same sky, less than 24 hours later, a missile came down in a residential neighborhood. Both of those things are true at the same time. They happened in the same place. And that simultaneity is not a dramatic device, it is the actual condition of life in this region. Hope and destruction do not take turns, they exist side by side every single day for the people who do not have the option of flying home when the situation changes. The doctors at the King Hussein Cancer Centre did not stop working when the missile hit. The patients did not pause their treatment. The mother from Gaza did not leave the waiting room. The Syrian teenager did not cancel his chemotherapy. They stayed. They kept going. Because the alternative, stopping, leaving, giving up, was never really an option for them. That is the real story here, not the near miss, not the celebrity proximity. The real story is that the work of building and preserving human life in this region continues, relentlessly, stubbornly, often invisibly, regardless of what is happening outside the walls. Harry and Meghan's presence at the King Hussein Cancer Centre will not stop missiles from being fired. It will not resolve decades of geopolitical tension. It will not end the conflicts that keep sending patients across borders with nothing but a referral letter and whatever hope they can carry. No hospital visit from any public figure, however genuine, however well-intentioned, can do those things. But that is not what the visit was for, and judging it by that standard misses the point entirely. What the visit did, what visits like this do, when they are done with the care and commitment that this one clearly was, is direct attention. It says, with the full weight of whatever platform a Sussex visit still carries globally, that the people in that hospital deserve to be seen, that the work being done inside those walls deserves to be named and acknowledged, that the suffering filling those wards is not a footnote to a larger political story. It is not context, it is not background, it is the story itself, and it deserves to be treated as such. There is a particular kind of invisibility that settles over populations caught in long-running conflicts. The first wave of international attention is intense. The news cameras come, the aid organizations mobilize, the world leaders make statements. But conflicts that last years, that stretch into decades, gradually fade from the global consciousness, even as the people living inside them continue to endure everything the initial crisis produced. The Syrian civil war is over a decade old. The Palestinian crisis is generations old. The people coming to the King Hussein Cancer Centre from those conflicts are not living through breaking news anymore. They are living through history that most of the world has moved on from. Harry and Meghan showing up in that hospital, sitting in those rooms, asking those questions, staying longer than the schedule required, is a refusal to move on. A deliberate public insistence that the people inside that building still exist, still matter, still deserve the attention of anyone with the ability to give it. There is a moment from the visit that has been described by those who witnessed it but has not been widely photographed. Meghan, at the end of a long hallway, paused beside a young nurse who looked utterly spent. She placed her hand lightly on the nurse's shoulder. The nurse closed her eyes. Neither of them said anything. It lasted only a few seconds. That moment will not make international headlines. It will not trend on any platform. It will not be cited in diplomatic cables or referenced in policy briefings. It produced no deliverable. It solved nothing in the quantifiable sense of that word. But the nurse will remember it. And in the context of a job that asks you to carry other people's pain for hours at a stretch, in a hospital that treats patients from the most difficult corners of the world, being seen by another human being, being acknowledged even briefly, even silently, is not nothing. It is, on some days, exactly what you need to keep going. Jordan has been here before, not in the sense of having missiles land in its capital. That is a rare and deeply disturbing event for a country that has worked so hard to position itself as a zone of relative stability, but in the sense of being the country that absorbs the consequences of decisions made by larger, more powerful actors. That is a role Jordan has been playing for generations, and it is exhausting, and it is expensive, and it never really ends. Since the Syrian civil war began over a decade ago, Jordan has taken in more than 1 million Syrian refugees. It was already hosting hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees from earlier conflicts. Iraqi families fled to Jordan in large numbers during and after the U.S. invasion. The country's population has swelled significantly beyond what its infrastructure was originally built to support. Water, always scarce in this part of the world, has become a chronic national security concern. The economy has been strained to its limits, and still, Jordan has kept the borders open. Still, it has chosen the harder, more expensive, more complicated path of being the place people can come to when everywhere else has closed. That choice has not come without cost, and it has not come without risk. The missile that landed in Amman was a reminder, brutal and sudden, that stability in this region is always provisional, that it can be interrupted at any time by forces that are not of Jordan's making and not within Jordan's control. What the strike revealed, beyond the immediate security implications, is the fragility of everything that has been built here. The careful, deliberate, expensive architecture of a functioning society in the middle of a fractured region can be disrupted in seconds by a decision made in a military command center hundreds of miles away. The Jordanian government did not choose this escalation. Its citizens did not vote for it. But they are the ones who woke up the morning after to find emergency vehicles in their streets. And yet, and this is the part that rarely makes the headlines, life in Amman continued. The markets opened the next morning. The hospitals kept running. The cancer center kept treating patients. The refugee camps kept operating. The schools, the taxi drivers, the families, the street vendors, they did not stop. They adapted, as they always have, and they kept going. That resilience deserves more attention than it gets. Jordan's ability to absorb shock, to process crisis and keep functioning, is not accidental. It is the product of decades of civic investment, of a population that has been through enough to understand that despair is not a viable long-term strategy. It is not dramatic, it does not make for a clean television moment, but it is real, and it is the thing that, more than any geopolitical calculation, keeps this part of the world from falling entirely apart. So here is where we land. A royal visit to a cancer hospital in Amman. 2 days of quiet, deliberate human engagement with patients who had traveled from some of the most dangerous and heartbroken places on Earth to receive care they could not access at home. A departure on the evening of February 27th. And less than 24 hours later, 10 kilometers away from where they had been sleeping, a missile. The timing is remarkable. The proximity is sobering. But neither of those things is what makes this story worth telling, or worth sitting with. What makes this story worth telling is what it reveals about the world right now, about the kind of world we are all living in, whether we are paying attention to it or not. A world in which compassion and violence occupy the same geography, in which a cancer ward and a missile impact site can be separated by 10 kilometers and one night, in which people continue to show up for each other, patients for doctors, doctors for patients, volunteers for strangers, strangers for strangers, even when everything happening outside says they have every reason to stop. The mother from Gaza is still in that waiting room, or somewhere like it. The boy from Syria began his chemotherapy on schedule. The nurses at the King Hussein Cancer Centre came in for their shifts the morning after the missile hit, as they always do. The work continued. It always continues. Not because it is easy, it is not easy, but because the people doing it have decided somewhere along the way that this is what they are for, that this is where they belong, that stopping is simply not something they are able to do. Harry and Meghan went to Jordan to shine a light on that work, to add their attention, their presence, and their platform to the effort of making it visible. They left before the darkness arrived, before the night that transformed a quiet capital into a crisis headline. But their leaving did not change what they found there, or what they left behind. It did not change the fact that they sat in those rooms, held those hands, and stayed. In a region where hope requires extraordinary effort to sustain, that showing up matters. It mattered to the nurse in the hallway. It mattered to the mother in the waiting room. It mattered to a 16-year-old boy who found himself able for a few minutes to stop being afraid. A royal visit meant to spotlight healing now sits against the backdrop of conflict and escalation. One day separated a humanitarian mission from a military crisis. And in a region where those two realities have always shared the same sky, perhaps the truest thing we can say is this: the world needs more people willing to walk into the difficult places and stay. Not because it solves everything, but because, for the people who live there every day, being seen by the rest of the world is not nothing. It never was.